Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The transport vessel that connected Meridian Station to the outer ring of Callaway Hub ran on schedule, which was, by the standards of interstellar public transit, something close to a miracle and entirely undeserved. It was not a beautiful ship. It was the kind of vessel that had been designed by committee, approved by budget, and decorated by someone who believed that the color gray existed in a sufficient number of variations to constitute an aesthetic philosophy. The passenger compartment smelled of recycled air and the particular brand of collective resignation that accumulates when 40-odd beings of varying biological requirements agree, silently and without discussion, that complaining will not improve the oxygen recyclers. Thessara Vel had taken the 0940 departure from Meridian because it was the cheapest available option, because she was between research postings, and because the Valley Institute of Xenocognitive Studies reimbursed travel expenses only up to a figure that suggested their accountants had last updated their understanding of ticket prices sometime before the expansion accords. She had a window seat, which she had specifically requested, and which looked out onto a view of uninterrupted black punctuated by the occasional distant smear of light that might have been a star cluster, or might have been a smudge on the viewport. It was difficult to say. She had stopped trying after the first hour. Her neural inhibitors had been performing without complaint for 11 years. They were Valley manufactured, third generation, the kind that came with a warranty card written in 4 languages and a strongly worded recommendation to schedule maintenance every 18 months. Thessara had last scheduled maintenance 14 months ago, which she would later describe to the technician as nearly on time, and which the technician would later describe in his incident report as a contributing factor. The failure, when it came, did not announce itself with drama. There was no alarm, no warning light, no small internal voice suggesting she might want to brace for impact. There was only a sensation she had not felt since her early training days, a slow, nauseating loosening, like the moment before a knot gives way. And then the thoughts of 39 other passengers arrived in her head simultaneously and without invitation. The woman in row 7 was composing, in meticulous and escalating detail, a message to someone named Dav who owed her money and apparently believed that time, applied generously enough to a debt, would transform it into a gift. A child near the front bulkhead was adjudicating a fierce internal trial over the moral failings of a fictional character, and the verdict, delivered with the solemn certainty only available to 9-year-olds, was not looking favorable for the defendant. Somewhere behind her, an elderly Vethani gentleman was thinking about a specific soup his grandmother had made, and the memory was so saturated with warmth and the smell of something like cinnamon that Thessara almost lost herself in it entirely before she remembered she had a crisis to manage. She pressed both hands flat against the armrests. She breathed. She deployed every technique her training had given her for exactly this kind of situation, which were numerous, well-documented, and currently performing about as well as a paper umbrella in a pressure leak. The thoughts kept coming. She cast her psychic awareness outward in a searching arc, not to read, but to anchor, the way a person falling reaches for anything solid, and latched onto the nearest stable consciousness available. The man beside her. She had catalogued him the way she catalogued all adjacent passengers, efficiently, minimally, with no intention of follow-up. Human male, mid-30s by their reckoning, the kind of face that had once held more openness than it currently did. A jacket of former quality, a scar above the left eyebrow that traced a curve too deliberate to be accidental. He had spent the journey reading something on a handheld screen and had not once attempted conversation, which had elevated him considerably in her estimation. She had not learned his name. She had not needed to. He was, in the taxonomy of fellow travelers, background, part of the landscape of a journey she intended to survive and forget. What she found inside his mind stopped her involuntary reach as completely as walking into a wall in the dark. Not chaos. Every xenopsychology paper she had ever read, written, or peer-reviewed described the human mind in the same fundamental terms. Energetic, associative, structurally diffuse, and about as easy to navigate as a room where someone has been spinning in circles with a fire hose. Humans had no natural psychic architecture. They were not built for it. Their thoughts moved laterally, emotionally, in great looping arcs that connected breakfast to childhood memories, to unresolved workplace grievances, without apparent concern for logical geography. Reading a human mind uninvited was, as a senior colleague had once described it, like trying to have a quiet conversation in the middle of a carnival that is also somehow on fire. What she found in his mind was silence. Precise, structured, deliberately load-bearing silence. The kind that does not occur naturally. The kind that is built. Thesara sat very still in her narrow seat, the recycled air moving indifferently around her, the gray walls of the compartment holding their positions with the commitment of things that have never been asked to do anything more interesting. Outside the smudged viewport, the stars continued their long, patient work of existing. The man beside her turned a page on his screen without looking up. She understood, with the slow and terrible clarity of someone who has opened a door that will not close again, that the 3 hours she had spent sitting beside this unremarkable human had been the most significant 3 hours of her career, and that he almost certainly knew it. She did not panic. This was important. Thesara Vel had been trained by the Valley Institute's most rigorous program in xenocognitive fieldwork, had spent 4 years studying alien consciousness in conditions that ranged from academically challenging to genuinely life-threatening, and had once maintained professional composure while accidentally reading the mind of a Dravathi ambassador who was, at that precise moment, thinking about something that would have scandalized 3 separate governments and a moderately progressive religious order. She was not someone who panicked. She panicked, internally and without visible evidence, which was the only saving grace available to her. On the outside, she was a Valley woman sitting very still in a transport seat with both hands flat on the armrests, which could be interpreted as calm or meditation, or simply the particular stillness of someone who has eaten questionable station food and is now entering negotiations with their own digestive system. On the inside, she was conducting a rapid and increasingly alarmed inventory of everything she had just accidentally accessed, cataloging it the way a person catalogs the contents of a bag they have just realized belongs to someone else, with the dawning understanding that they have already seen too much, and that simply closing the bag will not be sufficient. The architecture was the thing that kept stopping her. She had pulled back from the connection almost immediately. The moment she understood what she was touching, professional instinct had taken over from physical panic, but the impression remained the way impressions always remained, which was to say completely and without mercy. The structure of his conscious mind had been deliberate. That was the word she kept returning to, because it was the word that fit, and she was a scientist, and scientists used the words that fit even when those words made the rest of the sentence uncomfortable. Deliberate. Built. The thoughts she had brushed against on the outermost layer were present and functional, but organized in a way that no natural human neural pattern produced, arranged with a precision that her training told her required either a decade of intensive psychic conditioning or technological intervention, of a kind that human civilization had, officially and on record, not yet developed. The man turned another page on his screen. She watched him do it from her peripheral vision, which was all the attention she was prepared to give him while the rest of her mind was busy being alarmed. He had the quality of someone who was very good at being unremarkable, which was itself, she now understood, a quality worth remarking on. His body language was relaxed without being theatrical about it. His breathing was even. His jacket, the one that had been expensive 4 years ago, was draped with the comfortable looseness of a person who was simply sitting on a transport and reading something mildly interesting. And if there was a part of him that knew exactly what had just happened in the invisible architecture of the space between their seats, that part of him had apparently decided that the appropriate response was to continue reading. Thessara had a problem, and the problem had several layers, and she arranged them in order because arranging things in order was what she did when the alternative was staring at a stranger and visibly processing a small professional catastrophe. The first layer was the inhibitors. She needed to get the inhibitors back online, which required either a technician, an emergency override she could perform herself given 20 minutes of careful concentration, or the emergency suppression capsule she kept in the interior pocket of her travel coat for situations exactly like this one. Except that the capsule had a side effect profile that included approximately 4 hours of mild, but committed spatial disorientation, and the transport would arrive at Callaway Hub in 2 hours and 15 minutes, during which she would presumably need to navigate a transit hub, collect her baggage, and locate ground transport to the Institute's Callaway office. She had done worse things while mildly disoriented. She had also done them while not responsible for containing an accidental psychic intrusion into what appeared to be classified military neural architecture, so the variables were different. The second layer was the ethical one, which she disliked intensely because it did not resolve itself neatly and had a tendency to expand the longer she looked at it. She had entered his mind without consent. This was a breach of Velanthos professional conduct, Interspecies Accord Article 14, and her own personal standards, in roughly that order of formality and equal order of weight. The fact that it had been an accident mitigated the ethics without eliminating them. She knew things about his mind that she had no right to know, and the knowledge that those things were extraordinary did not make knowing them more acceptable, only more complicated. The third layer was the one she liked least, the one that sat quietly underneath the ethics and the practical problems and the question of the suppression capsule and its 4 hours of spatial inconvenience, and simply asked, in the calm and remorseless voice of genuine scientific instinct, if humanity had developed psychic defense architecture that their official records didn't document, and if this man was carrying it, and if the reason her involuntary reach had latched onto him specifically was that his mind was the most structurally stable consciousness in the compartment, then who, exactly, was he waiting to meet in Callaway Hub? The man closed his screen, folded it with one practiced motion, and turned to look at her for the first time in 3 hours with the patient, unhurried expression of someone who has decided that the conversation is going to happen anyway, and has simply been waiting for the more comfortable moment to begin it. "Your inhibitors are down," he said. Not a question. Thessara looked at him. "Yes," she said, because lying to a man whose mind read like a classified document seemed like a project with a poor return on investment. "Since approximately the meridian departure point." He nodded the way people nod when something confirms what they already suspected, and said, "That's about 40 minutes longer than the standard detection threshold." He paused. "You're better trained than your file suggests." The recycled air continued to move. The gray walls held their positions. Thessara sat with the information that she apparently had a file, and that the man who had read it was sitting 18 inches away from her and had known, for some unknowable portion of the last 3 hours, that she was inside his mind. "You have a file on me," she said. "Everyone interesting has a file," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was technically a smile, and contained absolutely no warmth, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had contained none at all. His name, he offered with the ease of someone surrendering something they knew you could find anyway, was Callum Bryce. He said it the way people say names that have been used professionally long enough that they have stopped feeling entirely personal, a label rather than an identity, functional and slightly worn at the edges. He did not offer anything else. He did not explain the file, or the detection threshold comment, or the fact that he had apparently spent 3 hours sitting beside a Valley telepath in mid-inhibitor collapse, while reading what she now strongly suspected was not recreational content on that handheld screen. He offered his name, settled back into his seat with the composure of a man who had attended a great many uncomfortable conversations and had long since made peace with their existence, and waited. Thesara decided that the suppression capsule was now the right decision. Not because the spatial disorientation seemed less problematic than it had 20 minutes ago. It remained equally problematic, and she had a working relationship with the Callaway Hub transit system that she preferred not to jeopardize. But because the alternative was continuing to sit within psychic range of a man whose mind she had already breached once, and whose conscious architecture was apparently designed to be, among other things, interesting. She did not trust her inhibitor-free concentration in the proximity of something interesting. This was not a personal failing. This was a professional assessment made by someone who knew herself well enough to be honest about her own weak points, and her weak point, if she was being entirely truthful, had always been exactly this: the thing that should not exist. She reached into her interior coat pocket with the controlled deliberateness of someone who wants to make clear that what they are retrieving is a medical device, and not, for instance, a weapon. The capsule was small and matte blue, and looked like something a cautious traveler might take for transport sickness, which was more or less accurate depending on how loosely you define the relevant terms. She pressed it against the side of her neck with 2 fingers. The mechanism engaged. She had approximately 12 minutes before the disorientation began, which gave her 12 minutes to establish what was happening, who this man was, and whether she needed to contact the Institute before or immediately after arriving at Callaway Hub. "You said I have a file," she said. "I would like to know who maintains it." "The agency I work for," Callum said, with the helpfulness of a man who has just answered a question in a technically accurate way. "You work for an agency." "Most people who have agencies work for them, yes." She looked at him steadily. The Valley were not, as a species, particularly given to expressions of exasperation. Their facial musculature operated on a more restrained register than humans, their features arranged in ways that human observers frequently described as serene, and which Thesara's colleagues described, more accurately, as the look of people who have learned to conduct their emotional lives somewhere less visible. But she had spent enough years among other species to have developed a small vocabulary of borrowed gestures, and she deployed one now, a long, measured exhale that conveyed, clearly and across the species boundary, that she found his answer insufficient. To his credit, the corner of his mouth moved again. This time it reached slightly further and contained something that was at least adjacent to genuine. "The agency is a subdivision of the interspecies Accord's intelligence framework," he said. "We work on anomalies, things that fall between what one species knows about another and what is actually true, gaps in the official record. And I am a gap in the official record. You're adjacent to one." He glanced down at his hands briefly, then back up. "The gap is me." This was, Thesara acknowledged privately, a more honest answer than she had expected, and it recalibrated several of the assessments she had been quietly running since the moment he had spoken the words "your inhibitors are down" with the calm of a man reading a weather report. She had been operating on the assumption that he was either the source of something hidden or the guardian of it, the possibility that he was both, and that he was aware of being both, and that he was choosing to tell her this on a transport vessel 40 minutes from Callaway Hub, while she was 12 minutes from pharmaceutical spatial disorientation, suggested either a level of trust she had not earned yet or a level of control over the situation that meant trust was not the relevant variable. "The neural architecture," she said carefully, because if they were doing this, if this conversation was actually happening in the way it appeared to be happening, then she was not going to pretend she hadn't found what she'd found. "What I accessed. It isn't natural human development." "No," he said. It's also not in any xenopsychology paper I've read, and I've read most of them, including several that are restricted. But I know which ones you have clearance for, he said, and then, perhaps reading something in the quality of her stillness, added, that came out more surveillance adjacent than I intended. I just meant that the research you'd have access to wouldn't cover this. It's not restricted. It doesn't exist in the literature because what was done to me wasn't done by anyone who publishes. The transport hummed around them, indifferent and continuous. Outside the viewport, the stars held their ancient positions and refused to offer commentary. Thesara processed the phrase "what was done to me" in the particular way she processed things that contained more weight than their grammatical structure suggested. Carefully, without immediately pressing on them, the way you test ice before you trust it with your full attention. You were modified, she said, not an accusation, a coordinate placed on a map she was still drawing. Restructured is the word the people who did it preferred. His voice remained level, but something shifted in the very outer layer of his expression, not much, barely enough to qualify, but she had 30 years of reading faces in lieu of minds, and she caught it. They felt it was more accurate. Modification implies addition. What they did was mostly organizational. He paused. They were very proud of that distinction. How many people know? Fewer than know about you. He reached into his jacket and produced a small card, physical, which was unusual enough in this decade to be deliberate, and placed it on the narrow surface between their seats. It had a contact identifier on it and nothing else. No agency name, no title. The Institute will want to debrief you when you land. Standard protocol for inhibitor failure in transit. His eyes met hers with the directness of someone who has decided that directness is now the only available efficiency. Tell them it was a false alarm. Tell them the capsule resolved it before meaningful exposure occurred. And then, when you've had 2 days to think about what you actually found in there, contact that identifier and tell me whether you think the gap in the official record is worth investigating. Thesara looked at the card. She looked at Callum Bryce. She felt, at the edges of her perception, the first mild suggestion that her spatial orientation was beginning its scheduled 4-hour renegotiation with reality, which meant the capsule was working, and she had approximately 90 seconds to form a coherent position on everything she had just been told. She picked up the card. You assumed I'd want to investigate, she said. You picked up the card, he said. She had no reasonable response to this, because he was correct, and she was a scientist, and the thing she had found in his mind was the most genuinely anomalous data she had encountered in 30 years of looking for exactly that. And the part of her that was a scientist, and the part of her that was a person who had just been handed a mystery, were, at this particular moment, entirely the same part. The transport began its descent toward Callaway Hub. The overhead lighting, still calibrated by someone without sympathy for eyes, flickered once and held. Thesara sat with a card in her hand, and 4 hours of spatial disorientation on the horizon and the quietly devastating certainty that her research posting between assignments had just become something considerably more significant than between. Callaway Hub, at the best of Thesara, navigated it with the careful, wide-stance deliberateness of a person for whom the floor had recently developed opinions about its own angle. The suppression capsule was doing its job with complete professional commitment, which meant her inhibitors were back online, and other people's thoughts were blessedly silent, and also meant that the moving walkway to baggage collection appeared, to her current neurological situation, to be moving in 2 directions simultaneously. She stepped onto it anyway. She had dignity to maintain. She was a senior researcher with the Valley Institute of Xenocognitive Studies, and she had faced down 3 decades of other people's uninvited consciousness, and she was not going to be defeated by infrastructure. She collected her bag from the carousel on the 2nd attempt. The first attempt had involved a bag that was the same color as hers, and belonged to a Vethani family who had accepted its return with more grace than she deserved. She found a bench near the ground transport bay, and sat on it with the posture of someone who has chosen to sit down for entirely voluntary, non-disorientation-related reasons. And she thought about what she was going to tell the Institute. The debriefing request had come through on her personal communicator before the transport had finished docking standard procedure, as Callum had said, for inhibitor failure in transit. Field Protocol 7, which she had helped revise 4 years ago, and which she now regarded with the complicated feelings of someone who has written a rule that is currently being applied to themselves. She was required to report any uncontrolled psychic contact made during the inhibitor failure. She was required to provide a full account of the nature, duration, and content of any accidental connection. She was required to do this within 6 hours of landing, in writing, with a signed declaration of accuracy at the bottom. She had the card in her interior coat pocket. She could feel its physical weight, which was minimal and entirely disproportionate to its actual weight, which was considerable. She thought about the architecture of Callum Bryce's mind, not the contents. She had been rigorous about not pressing further into what she touched, had treated the impression the way she treated any data obtained outside ethical parameters, with the discipline of someone who believes that how you handle information matters as much as what the information is. But the structure, the deliberate load-bearing silence, the evidence of something done to a human nervous system that human science, officially and on record, had not done. The phrase "what was done to me," and the way he had said it, not with self-pity, which would have been easier, but with the flat accuracy of someone who has had a long time to find the correct terminology for their own history. The Institute would want to know everything. The Institute would deploy its own people within 48 hours, open a formal inquiry, notify the Interspecies Accords Research Division, and begin the process of turning what she had found into a documented case study with her name on the cover page and his life as the primary subject. She knew this because she knew the Institute, had worked within it for 22 years, respected its methods and its purpose and most of its people, and understood that organizations built to study anomalies could not always be trusted to remember that anomalies were also, frequently, persons. She had changed, she realized, sitting on the bench in the badly signed transit hub while her spatial orientation conducted its gradual reconciliation with established physics. Not enormously. Not in any way that would be visible to anyone looking at her from the outside, which was the veily way changes that registered internally before they registered anywhere else, if they registered anywhere else at all. But she had spent 30 years studying other minds with the confidence of someone who knew what she was looking for, and what she had found in the space between Meridian Station and Callaway Hub was something she had not known to look for, which was a different and more significant experience than she had accounted for in her professional self-image. She contacted the Institute. She reported an inhibitor failure, mid-transit, resolved by emergency suppression capsule before meaningful contact occurred. She signed the declaration of accuracy with the precise, unhurried signature of a woman who had made a decision and was not planning to revisit it before she had more information. She filed the report and put her communicator away and sat for another moment with the specific quality of stillness that follows a choice that cannot be undone. Then she took out the card and contacted the identifier. The response came back in under a minute, which told her that Callum Bryce was either very efficient or had been expecting this, and she had already formed a view on which of those was more likely. The message contained a time, a location inside Callaway's civilian research quarter, and a single additional line that she read twice and then found herself, despite everything and against her own better judgment, and with the full awareness that this was entirely unprofessional, almost smiling at. It read, "I told you you'd pick up the card." She stood up from the bench with the careful optimism of someone whose floor was approximately 90% reliable, collected her bag, and walked toward the exit, one of the 4 genuine ones, which she found on the 3rd attempt, and out into the gray, crowded, imperfectly mapped reality of Callaway Hub street level, where the sky was the color of old data, and the air smelled of transit fuel and something almost like rain. She had 2 days before the meeting. She intended to use them to review every piece of xenopsychological literature she had access to, every classified paper her clearance permitted, every documented case of human neural anomaly in the Accord's open research record. She was not going to find what she was looking for. She already knew that. The gap in the official record, as Callum had called it, was a gap precisely because someone had been careful. But 30 years of looking for things that weren't where they were supposed to be had given her one working principle she trusted above all others, which was that the absence of evidence was itself a shape, and shapes could be read, and she was very good at reading things that weren't designed to be read. The transport between Meridian and Callaway ran daily. She had taken it for practical reasons, at a budget-conscious fare, with no expectation of consequence. She walked out of the hub into the imperfect air of a city she knew moderately well and thought about how the most significant coordinates of a life rarely announce themselves as significant at the moment of arrival. She thought about a man with a scar above his eyebrow and a mind built like something the official record had never been told to look for. She thought about the version of herself that had boarded the 9:40 departure that morning with nothing more professionally pressing than a research posting and a reimbursement form. That version of herself, she decided, had been between things. She was no longer between things. She was, for the first time in longer than she wanted to calculate, precisely in the middle of one.